The infamous Great Train Robbery. How the criminals got away with $30 million. The night the tracks went silent. On a cold night, beneath a moon that offered no mercy, a train hurtled through the darkness carrying more than passengers and cargo. It carried money, a lot of money. And somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the glow of the signal lights, men were waiting. They were not armed with military firepower. They were not backed by governments. They had no advanced technology. What they had instead was time, precision, and a plan so audacious that law enforcement would later admit something unthinkable. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the criminals were already gone. No alarms, no witnesses who could identify them, no immediate trail, just an empty stretch of track. And $30 million vanished into the night. This was not a smash and grab. This was not luck. This was one of the most meticulously executed robberies in modern history. And for decades, one question has refused to die. How did they pull it off? And why were so many of them never truly caught? Tonight, we uncover the infamous Great Train Robbery, the perfect target. To understand how this robbery succeeded, you first need to understand why this train mattered. Every night, across thousands of miles of steel track, trains move unseen, carrying freight, fuel, food, and sometimes cash. Not armored trucks, not guarded vaults. Trains. In the decades leading up to the robbery, rail transport had become the invisible backbone of large-scale money movement. Banks trusted it. Governments relied on it. Security protocols were built on one dangerous assumption. No one would ever dare to stop a moving train in open territory. That assumption would prove fatal. The target was a high-value cash transport run, a routine journey so common it barely raised an eyebrow. Millions in currency were loaded aboard, sealed, documented, and logged into a system that prioritized efficiency over suspicion. No armed escort riding inside. No real-time tracking. No contingency plan for sabotage. To the operators, this was just another shift. To the criminals watching from the shadows, it was an invitation. Because the most successful robberies don't attack the vault. They attack the routine, the men who watch the tracks. They didn't start as a gang. There was no dramatic meeting, no oath, no code name. What united them wasn't loyalty, it was opportunity. Some had criminal records. Some didn't. Some had worked rail jobs before. Others had connections in logistics, transport, and cash handling. What they shared was knowledge. They knew when the train ran. They knew where it slowed. They knew which stretch of track sat just far enough from town to avoid attention, but close enough to escape quickly. For months, possibly longer, they watched. They timed the signals. They studied maintenance schedules. They noted how long crews stayed inside cabins. They learned which procedures existed only on paper. This was surveillance without cameras. Reconnaissance without drones. Just men, notebooks, binoculars, and patience. And eventually, they discovered the weakness that would change everything. A section of track where a signal could be manually interfered with, forcing the train to slow without triggering immediate alerts. A vulnerability no one believed anyone would exploit. The night the signal turned red, the operation began without violence. No sirens, no shouting, no gunfire. Just a red signal glowing in the darkness where green should have been. Inside the locomotive, the driver followed protocol, easing the massive machine to a crawl. That decision, made in good faith, sealed the outcome. Because as the train slowed, the robbers moved. They boarded with practiced speed. They knew exactly which car to access, exactly how long they had. The crew was overwhelmed not with brutality, but with certainty. The criminals spoke calmly. They issued instructions, not threats. They understood something crucial. Fear causes mistakes. Confidence causes compliance. Within minutes, the money was transferred not chaotically, but methodically, into waiting vehicles positioned beyond the track. No explosions. No casualties. By the time the train was cleared to move again, the robbery was already over. The Vanishing Act. This is where the story should have ended. Criminals flee. Police respond. Manhunt begins. But that's not what happened. By the time authorities reached the scene, The escape routes were cold. No license plates. No usable fingerprints. No reliable eyewitness descriptions. The money was already fractured, split, laundered, hidden. And that's when investigators began to realize something unsettling. This wasn't just a robbery. It was an exit strategy. Every move suggested the criminals had planned not only how to steal the money, but how to disappear afterward. Some would be arrested years later. Others would vanish entirely, and portions of the money were never recovered. The mistake that exposed everything. Every perfect crime carries a flaw, not always in the plan, but in the people. For weeks after the robbery, law enforcement had nothing tangible to work with. No suspects. No credible leads. The case stalled almost as quickly as it began. Publicly, officials insisted progress was being made. Privately, many feared the truth. The criminals had outpaced the system. Then, quietly, the first mistake surfaced. It wasn't at the scene. It wasn't caught on camera. It didn't involve the train at all. It happened after money was gone, when discipline gave way to confidence. One of the men began spending, not extravagantly, not foolishly, just noticeably. New car, cash purchases, a lifestyle shift subtle enough to feel safe, but sharp enough to attract attention from people trained to notice exactly that. Investigators had long known this pattern. Large thefts don't unravel through genius police work. They unravel through human behavior. And this behavior lit the first match. The long shadow of surveillance. The response was not immediate arrests. Instead, something far more dangerous began. Observation. Phones were monitored. Movements logged. Associates mapped. Investigators didn't know who had robbed the train, but they suspected the type of people who could have done it. Men with logistics knowledge. Men with access. Men who knew rail systems not as outsiders, but as insiders. Slowly a web formed. One suspect led to another. One name appeared twice, then 3 times. It wasn't proof, but it was proximity. And proximity is where criminal empires often collapse. The informant who changed the case. He was never meant to talk. He wasn't one of the planners. He wasn't one of the leaders. He was peripheral, a connector, a man who knew people, not details. And that's exactly why he cracked. Pressure doesn't work on masterminds. It works on the margins. When investigators finally brought him in, they didn't threaten him with prison. They threatened him with irrelevance. The idea that others would walk free while he carried the consequences alone. That fear opened the door. He didn't give names. He didn't give locations. What he gave instead was confirmation. Yes, it was an inside-informed operation. Yes, the train was selected months in advance. Yes, the money had already been divided. And yes, some of it was already gone forever. That was enough to change everything. The collapse begins. Arrests came slowly, intentionally. Authorities didn't want panic. They wanted mistakes. As suspects realized law enforcement was circling closer, paranoia replaced trust. Phones went silent. Meetings stopped. Old alliances fractured. One man fled. Another turned on an associate. A third tried to negotiate before he was even charged. The group that had once operated with surgical precision now unraveled under its own weight, not because the plan failed, but because the aftermath wasn't controlled. Trial silence and missing millions. Courtrooms finally replaced train tracks. Some defendants spoke. Others said nothing. Evidence was circumstantial. Testimony conflicted. Timelines blurred. Convictions came, but not closure. Because the sentences were handed down, one fact became impossible to ignore. A significant portion of the $30 million was never found. No accounts. No property. No trace. Just rumors. Hidden caches. Buried containers. Money moved offshore under names that no longer existed. Investigators suspected they were chasing ghosts. And ghosts don't testify. Why the robbery still haunts authorities. This robbery didn't just steal money. It exposed assumptions. Rail security was redesigned. Cash transport protocols were rewritten. Entire industries acknowledged a blind spot they never believed existed. The criminals didn't overpower the system. They outthought it. And that's why this case still echoes through law enforcement training programs decades later. Not as a story of violence, but as a warning. The greatest threat isn't force. It's familiarity. The man who knew where the money was. Every major investigation eventually centers on one figure. Not always the leader, not always the loudest, but the one whose absence creates the largest void. In this case, investigators believe there was a man who never touched the train, never boarded the cars, never appeared at the scene, yet may have controlled the most important part of the operation, the money after it disappeared. He was known only through fragments, a nickname in a notebook, a blurred figure in surveillance photos taken weeks after the robbery, a voice described by witnesses, but never recorded. What made him different was not authority. It was restraint. While others spent, fled, or panicked, he stayed invisible. No sudden purchases. No lifestyle changes. No obvious connections to those already under suspicion. To investigators, that discipline was suspicious in itself. Because in large-scale crimes, the person who profits the most is often the one who draws the least attention. The missing millions theory. Officially, a portion of the stolen $30 million was recovered. Unofficially, that number never satisfied anyone. Too much was missing. Too many loose ends remained. Over time, a theory began to circulate inside investigative circles. Never proven, never dismissed. The money was never meant to be recovered. According to this theory, the robbers did not plan to spend most of the cash domestically at all. Instead, it was allegedly converted, slowly and quietly, into assets that left no obvious trail. Foreign accounts opened under layered identities. High-value items resold years later through intermediaries. Cash stored untouched, waiting for attention to fade. This wasn't laundering in the traditional sense. It was hibernation. And if true, it meant the real success of the robbery wasn't measured in arrests or sentences, but in what was never seen again. The ones who walked free. Not everyone paid a price. Some suspects were questioned and released. Some were never charged. Some were never even identified. Files remained sealed. Names remain redacted. To this day, former investigators admit, off the record, that they believe at least one key participant was never caught. Not because of corruption, not because of incompetence, but because the evidence simply wasn't there. No fingerprints, no direct testimony, no financial trail that could survive a courtroom. The law demands proof. And in this case, proof dissolved faster than suspicion. How the robbery changed crime forever. This robbery didn't inspire copycats. It discouraged them. Because what most people misunderstood was this. The criminals didn't win because they were bold. They won because they were boring. No dramatic shootouts. No cinematic chaos. Just preparation, restraint, and an understanding of how systems grow lazy. Afterward, rail companies implemented layered safeguards. Cash transport adopted redundancy. Routine became the enemy of security. And criminals learned something too. This level of success could not be repeated easily. It required too much patience, too much silence, too much trust. The question that never went away. Years later, investigators still ask it, not in press conferences, not in reports, but quietly among themselves. If the robbery happened today, would it still work? Technology has changed. Surveillance has expanded. Tracking is constant. And yet, every system still relies on routine. Every safeguard still assumes compliance, which means the real legacy of the Great Train Robbery is not the money. It's a reminder that systems don't fail loudly. They fail slowly. Where the story ends and doesn't, time does not resolve crimes. It only rearranges their consequences. Years passed. Sentences were served. Headlines faded. Files were boxed, archived, and labeled closed, a bureaucratic word that rarely means understood. Some of the men involved aged quietly behind walls, measured not by notoriety but by routine. Counts, meals, lights out. Others re-entered society under conditions that stripped away any public trace of who they once were. Names changed. Addresses shifted. Conversations became careful. And then there were the ones who were never there to begin with. Investigators still debate whether the man who knew where the money was truly existed, or whether he was a composite, a convenient explanation for missing millions. But the absence remains, a silence where an answer should be. Because when authorities finally stopped asking questions, the money still hadn't finished speaking. Artifacts of crime. Crimes leave artifacts. Not souvenirs. Echoes. A torn glove recovered miles from the tracks. A receipt for fuel bought in cash. Logged hours before the robbery. A notebook page with numbers that meant nothing, until they meant everything. These fragments sat in evidence lockers for decades, occasionally re-examined when a new investigator inherited the case and asked the same questions with fresh eyes. Could this be a coordinate? A time window? A distribution split? Most led nowhere. But some investigators believe those artifacts weren't meant to guide police at all. They were reminders for the criminals, a breadcrumb trail only they could read, pointing to places never searched, assets never frozen, caches that would only be safe once everyone stopped looking. The money that refused to surface. Money has gravity. It attracts attention. And yet, millions vanish without causing a ripple large enough to expose it. No sudden investments. No extravagant purchases tied back to suspects. No identifiable laundering networks collapsing under scrutiny. That absence became its own mystery. Some believe the cash was destroyed, burned to erase its trail. Others argue it was never cash for long, transformed quietly into assets that matured over decades. Property bought through intermediaries, commodities held offshore, businesses launched and sold without fanfare. The most unsettling theory is also the simplest. The money was never meant to be spent quickly. It was meant to wait. Lessons written in steel. Every major theft rewrites the rule book. After the Great Train Robbery, the changes were subtle but profound. Rail operators revised signaling redundancies. Cash movements were fragmented into smaller, less attractive loads. Human oversight was paired, then replaced with automated verification. But technology only goes so far. Because the real lesson wasn't about trains. It was about assumptions. That no one would watch long enough. That no one would plan patiently enough. That no one would accept a crime with no spectacle. The criminals exploited the belief that danger announces itself. It doesn't. The last unanswered question. If you ask former investigators what keeps them up at night, it isn't the arrest that didn't happen. It's the possibility that the robbery succeeded exactly as intended. Not partially, not imperfectly, completely. That the right people were caught to satisfy the public. That enough money was recovered to suggest closure. And that the rest, quietly, patiently, fulfilled its purpose. To change lives no one could trace back to a train that slowed in the dark. The tracks keep running. Somewhere tonight, a train is moving through darkness. Its cargo logged. Its route approved. Its routine unquestioned. And somewhere else, someone understands that routine better than anyone should. The Great Train Robbery didn't end with arrests or sentences. It ended with a realization. The most effective crimes don't announce themselves. They blend in. They pass unnoticed. And by the time the world looks up from the tracks, they're already gone. The echo left on the tracks. In the end, the Great Train Robbery wasn't just about money. It was about patience, about silence, about how systems built on routine can be undone by those willing to wait longer than anyone expects. Some questions were answered. Some men were punished. But somewhere between the red signal and the empty tracks, something escaped justice. Maybe it was money, maybe it was truth, or maybe it was a realization that the most dangerous crimes don't end in chaos. They end in quiet success, because trains still run, money still moves, and the world still believes it would never happen again. But history doesn't repeat itself loudly. It whispers. And if this story made you question what you think you know about crime, power, and the systems that govern them, take a moment to like this video. It helps these stories reach more people. Share it with someone who loves true crime and real investigations, the kind that don't hand you easy answers. And subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the crimes that changed the world, and the ones that were never truly solved.